Now, we've looked a little bit at open records, but there's an even broader legislation that will help us get access to information, and it's called the Freedom of Information Act. Now, Foia, as we know it, was established federally in 1966, and it requires that all records that are held by federal government agencies be made available to the public. And it's important to remember that distinction. It's not every record that exists in the world. It's federal records that are operated, they are created by agencies. And the idea of what the Supreme Court decided was that disclosure, not secrecy, is the dominant objective of this act, and it really should be a focus of government. So before Foia, the burden was on the person who requested the records to show why they had a right to them. There wasn't really any guideline or procedure in place to help someone who was seeking information, and there wasn't really the opportunity for judicial review if they didn't get the information. But after Foia, the burden of proof, for the most part, shifted from the individual to the government. Now, you'll notice that this cartoon has sunshine laws. So sunshine laws are the state laws, and Foia is the one that deals specifically with the federal government and the agencies that operate under the federal government. And it's really kind of putting in this need-to-know standard was being replaced by the right to know information. So here are some basics of Foia, and I've given you over here on the right an example of a request that's been made to the NTSB, the National Transportation and Safety Board. It applies to executive federal agencies only, so it does not apply to Congress, the federal courts, a court-martial system, and military during wartime. It requires federal agencies to publish in the Federal Register what exactly their organization is, who would handle FOIA requests, and the procedure by which you could make a FOIA request. And all records have to be segregated so that not just an entire record can be classified as exempt, only the part that would really need to be exempt. So the way you make a request is you address it to a specific agency. So if you wanted to get crime statistics, for example, you would make a request to the FBI. If you wanted to get information on food safety, you would make it to the agency that handled the USDA, or of drugs, the Food and Drug Administration. So you locate that office through this United States government manual, which I've given you a link to. And if you're not sure, you can always make the request to multiple agencies. So you need to write it down. That's really the only criteria, is just that it's written. So it doesn't have to be on stationery. It can be an email. It's short, simple, just plain English. You can address it to the agency's FOIA officer, and then always put on the envelope that this is a Freedom of Information Act request. So the elements of the request, as I've shown them here, is it should specifically state that you're making a request under FOIA. It should identify the records and as specifically as possible, and that's a really big deal because one of the main reasons that your request would be kicked back is because it's overbroad. So if you send a note to the FBI and say, I'm making a FOIA request and I want to have all the crime statistics for the state of Ohio from the years 2010 to 2015, that's a very, very broad request. There's a lot of data there. So you really need to think about what exactly you want and expect that someone is going to come back to you and say this is too broad, and try to narrow it down before you get to that point. Then make sure to include your name, your address, your phone number so they know how to get in touch with you. Now, they can say no, and they can also redact information. This is an example of something that's been redacted. You have to make them, you can make them prove why the record's not available. Make sure your request is complete and make sure the request is narrow enough. Those are the key ways that you can try to help your request get moved along. Now, there are exemptions, so there are things that the federal government does not need to give up. National security, as I'm sure you can guess, is a big one. They mention that one a lot. Internal agency rules and procedures don't have to be submitted through FOIA. Anything that's a statutory exemption, so it's by law. Trade secrets, agency memos, something that's considered to be personal privacy, and certain law enforcement records are exempted.